Ruth Stout, the woman who let nature do the work. Ruth Imogene Stout was born on June 14, 1884, in Topeka, Kansas, though she never much cared for dates. She once said that life was meant to be lived, not catalogued, and that no one ever grew a good tomato by staring at a calendar. She was one of 9 children, part of a family full of readers, thinkers, and talkers. Her parents were Quakers who believed in simplicity, honesty, and hard work, though Ruth, even as a child, had her own opinions about that last part. She once told a friend that she was born allergic to unnecessary effort. As a young woman, she was curious and restless. She moved from one job to another, trying to find something that fit. She worked as a teacher for a time, then a secretary, then as a clothing sales clerk. During World War I, she volunteered for Quaker relief work in Europe. After that, she came back to the States, worked with the YMCA, and traveled from place to place, never really settling. She was bright, independent, and stubborn as a weed in July. In her 40s, Ruth finally married a man named Fred Stout, a quiet, thoughtful fellow who had worked with the Singer sewing machine company. They settled in Connecticut, on a modest patch of land with a few trees, a small house, and soon enough, a garden. Ruth didn't know it then, but that bit of ground would change her life, and the way millions of people thought about gardening. At first, she did what everyone else did. She waited for a man with a plow to come and turn the soil each spring. And each spring, she waited longer. The man always seemed to have better paying jobs elsewhere, and Ruth was left pacing her yard, packet of seeds in hand, feeling trapped by someone else's schedule. One spring, the plowman never came at all. Out of patience and armed with little more than stubbornness, Ruth decided she'd just plant anyway. She took her seeds, pulled back some of the old straw and compost from the year before, poked holes in the soil with her finger, dropped the seeds in, and covered them back up with hay. To her surprise, they grew. When harvest came, her vegetables looked better than ever. Rich, full, and plentiful. The soil beneath that mulch was dark and alive with worms. That's when Ruth had one of those rare, life-changing thoughts that seem simple only in hindsight. Maybe the earth didn't need so much help after all. From that year on, she never plowed again. No tilling, no hoeing, no endless backbreaking labor. She called it no-work gardening, and though the name was half in jest, it turned out to be truer than most people believed. Ruth quickly learned that her thick mulch, a mixture of straw, leaves, and whatever organic material she could scrounge, did almost everything a gardener could ask for. It kept weeds down, held moisture in the soil, prevented erosion, and fed the earth as it rotted. The worms did the tilling, rain took care of the watering, and Ruth took care of the eating. When people came by and saw her garden, they'd ask, "How much mulch should I use?" Ruth would give them her trademark answer: "More." She became known for her sharp wit as much as her gardening wisdom. When critics claimed her method couldn't possibly work, she'd smile and say, "Well, the vegetables haven't heard that yet." She once wrote, "I never plow, spade, sow a cover crop, harrow, hoe, cultivate, weed, water or spray. I just keep a thick mulch of whatever rots." Ruth's garden became a curiosity. Neighbors who once thought she was daft soon noticed that her crops were thriving, often better than theirs. While they were out sweating behind rototillers and hoes, Ruth was on her porch sipping coffee and reading. Her mornings started late, usually after what she called a proper, leisurely breakfast. She'd wander into the garden barefoot, check on her plants, pull a weed or two just for the principle of it, and be finished by late morning. "I never work past 11 o'clock, she said proudly. "Why would I? I've got living to do." The Stouts lived simply. Ruth grew nearly all the vegetables they ate: potatoes, beans, squash, tomatoes, cucumbers, lettuce, and corn, all under mulch, all thriving. She didn't use chemical fertilizers or pesticides. When bugs showed up, she trusted nature to sort it out. She said, "You can spend your life fighting bugs, but I prefer to let them argue among themselves." As word spread, people came from near and far to see her garden. She began writing articles for gardening magazines and eventually published her first book in 1955, How to Have a Green Thumb Without an Aching Back. It was full of dry humor and practical wisdom, written in her plain-spoken style. She followed that with Gardening Without Work, for the aging, the busy, and the indolent, which summed up her philosophy in one sentence: "I'm not lazy, I'm just allergic to doing things nature does better." By the 1960s, she had become something of a celebrity among gardeners. She gave talks at garden clubs and agricultural societies across the country, often to audiences who weren't quite sure whether to laugh or take notes. Ruth would appear in her broad straw hat and comfortable clothes, speaking without notes, leaning on the podium like she was chatting with old friends. She'd begin by saying, "Now I don't have much to teach you, I just have a few years of common sense to pass along." And then she'd launch into stories about worms, weather, and the folly of overworking the land. When agricultural experts challenged her ideas, she welcomed it. "It's fine," she'd say. "I like to argue. Keeps the compost turning." Her humor was her secret weapon. She could make people laugh at themselves, and once they laughed, they listened. Slowly but surely, her no-till philosophy started to take root. Ruth often said that her best teacher was nature. "Go look at the woods," she'd tell people. "Nobody tills the forest floor. Nobody waters it. Nobody sprays it, and yet it grows, year after year. Why do we think our gardens need more than that?" Her approach wasn't just easier, it was better for the soil. What she called laziness was, in truth, ecological wisdom ahead of its time. The mulch protected soil microbes, prevented erosion, and locked carbon in the ground. Decades later, scientists would confirm that her no-work method built healthier, more sustainable ecosystems. But Ruth never used words like ecosystem or carbon sequestration. She said, "I just want a tomato that tastes like a tomato." In her later years, Ruth continued to write and speak, becoming something of a folk hero for gardeners and a thorn in the side of traditional agricultural experts. She loved to poke fun at big agriculture. "If you have to buy a machine to do it," she said, "maybe you shouldn't be doing it." She lived by her own rhythm. Her days began late, her mornings were short, and her evenings were long. She enjoyed reading, writing letters, and entertaining visitors. Her laugh was loud, her opinions were louder, and her independence never faded. Even in her 90s, she was still gardening, barefoot, hat crooked, and happy as ever. When someone asked if she still mulched as thick as before, she smiled and said, "More." Ruth passed away in 1980 at the age of 96, leaving behind not only her books but a movement. Her simple, honest belief that nature knows best helped spark the organic gardening revolution. She proved that no work wasn't laziness, it was wisdom. Today, her name still surfaces wherever people talk about sustainable gardening. Videos of her old interviews circulate online, her voice rich with laughter and plain truth. She remains a kind of patron saint of common sense, the woman who dared to say that maybe the earth didn't need so much managing after all. Ruth Stout once said, "I never do anything I don't want to do. I suppose that's why I've been happy all my life." Her happiness was rooted, quite literally, in the soil, in trusting the quiet intelligence of the earth, in finding joy in simplicity, and in doing things her own way. So the next time you find yourself sweating over a stubborn patch of ground, think of Ruth, sitting under a tree, straw hat tilted, sipping coffee while her garden grows itself, and remember her favorite bit of advice. Don't overcomplicate it. Nature knows what she's doing. You just have to give her a chance, and a little mulch. So if Ruth Stout's story spoke to you, if you've ever wondered whether there's an easier, kinder way to work with the land instead of against it, then maybe her no-work gardening is worth a look. You can still find her books online, Gardening Without Work and How to Have a Green Thumb Without an Aching Back, and even a few old interviews where Ruth herself, sitting in her Connecticut garden, explains her methods in that no-nonsense way of hers. And if you enjoyed this story, give it a like, share it with someone who loves gardening, and subscribe for more stories about the people who changed how we live, grow, and see the world, one seed at a time.